Good afternoon. I am Brittany Drakeford, and I'm an urban planner with the National Capital Planning Commission. Thank you for joining us today for our public meeting on the update to the introduction chapter of the federal elements for the comprehensive plan and equity updates on the submission guidelines. The National Capital Planning Commission is the federal planning agency for the National Capital Region. In 2022, we launched an effort to update the introduction chapter of the federal elements of the comprehensive plan, which is a statement of principles, goals, and planning policies for the growth and development of the National Capital Region, with specific emphasis on federal lands and the federal interests during the next 20 years. The introduction chapter outlines the planning framework for the comprehensive plan's federal elements, and the update is intended to modernize the chapter to address critical planning challenges and current agency initiatives, including equity, climate change, and resiliency. The comprehensive plan elements are updated on a rolling basis, with the introductions chapter last being updated in 2016. On December 7th of 2023, the Commission authorized the release of the draft introduction chapter update and the corresponding submission guidelines for a 90-day public comment period that will close on Tuesday, March 12th, 2024. During our time today, we will walk through the major changes to both the introduction chapter and the submission guidelines. Please be aware that today's meeting will be recorded, and there will be several segments for questions and answers throughout our discussion today. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen. And so with that, I want to get started and introduce and acknowledge my NCPC colleagues who are joining us today. Mike Sherman, who is the director of our Policy and Research Division, Diane Sullivan, who is the director of our Urban Design and Plan Review Division, Krishan Smith, who is the project manager for the Introduction Chapter Update, Laura Shipman, who is the project manager for our Submission Guidelines Update, Melissa Linshaw, who's an urban planner in our Policy and Research Division, who is supporting with our Introduction Chapter Update, and Bizrat Mizgebe, who is supporting us from our Office of Engagement, as well as Stephen Stoddicle and Steve Morgan. As a reminder, this is the first of two public meetings on the introduction chapter and submission guidelines. Our next public meeting will take place on Tuesday, February 20th at 6 p.m. This next meeting is an in-person meeting that will be held at the NCPC offices. I encourage you to share this information with other interested individuals, stakeholders, or colleagues, and you can register for our February 20th workshop or February 20th public meeting by visiting the project website at ncpc.gov/initiatives/intro. And then after the meeting today, if you have any additional questions or would like to schedule time to discuss the proposal with staff, you can email your requests to info@ncpc.gov, or again, visit our project website. As I mentioned, we are in the public comment period of the introduction chapter and submission guidelines review. So any comments that you would like to have formally included on the record for this project must be submitted in writing via mail or email. Written comments can be sent directly to our NCPC offices, and our address is listed on the slide above. Or you can provide digital comments using the comment portal on our project website. And we'll make sure we share this information throughout the presentation, and there are additional opportunities for you to write this down. And for a little context, updating the introduction chapter of the federal elements of the comprehensive plan is one of several projects that NCPC is undertaking to address equity in our work. Some other projects that we are working on include the Beyond Granite, which is a partnership between the Trust for the National Mall and the National Park Service to develop, developed a demonstration program that aims to broaden subject matter representation and elevate underrepresented stories on the National Mall. We are also working on revising the Federal Capital Improvement Plan, or FCIP, to address the equity impacts that federal installations have on neighboring communities. For these revisions, staff have worked with the Office of Management and Budget to incorporate equity-related questions for applicants to answer for NCPC review to determine how proposed capital improvement projects might create or reduce equity disparities. We are also celebrating the agency's 100-year anniversary, so it is our centennial. And we're using this as an opportunity to examine the legacy of planning and development in the region, and specifically where NCPC's role in planning efforts may have resulted in inequitable outcomes and how that shapes our communities today. Finally, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation, our staff is also working on evaluating our plan review process to amend the submission guidelines to include equity screening questions for new construction projects and to encourage applicants to conduct public outreach earlier in the development of their projects. So our goals for today include sharing information about our approach to updating the introduction chapter of the Federal Comprehensive Plan, as well as soliciting feedback from you on the work. Specifically, we're going to discuss the history of NCPC and the purpose of the federal elements of the Comprehensive Plan. We'll review our major changes to the introduction chapter, review our major changes to the submission guidelines, and then take any questions that you may have. So again, throughout this session, we'll have opportunities for discussion and question and answers, and we encourage you to submit your questions via the question and answer portal that's located at the bottom of the screen. With that, I will turn it over to Krishan Smith. I'll turn it over to Krishan Smith, who will walk us through an overview of NCPC and the Comprehensive Plan.
Let's see. Thanks, Brittany. Before getting into a discussion on our draft, we wish to provide an overview of our agency and our guiding document at the agency, the Comprehensive Plan. The National Capital Planning Commission is the federal government's central planning agency for the National Capital Region, which includes Washington, D.C. and the adjoining counties in Maryland and Virginia. Through planning, policymaking, and project review, NCPC protects and advances the federal government's interests in the region's development. The Commission provides overall planning guidance for federal land and buildings in the region by reviewing the design of federal and certain local projects, overseeing long-range planning for future development, and monitoring capital investment by federal agencies. NCPC is comprised of 4 divisions: Policy and Research, Urban Design and Plan Review, Office of Public Engagement, and the Fiscal Planning Division. Each division performs specialized tasks related to NCPC's overall mission and goals. NCPC is the federal government's central planning agency in the National Capital Region. Our mission reflects our stewardship and responsibility of the extraordinary federal resources and assets of the capital. Washington, D.C. is unique as the nation's capital and the seat of the federal government. At the same time, Washington is a thriving local city responsive to the needs of local residents. Planning responsibilities are shared jointly to address national and local needs in a way that is also unique among American cities. The National Capital Planning Commission was established nearly 100 years ago. In 1924, Congress established the National Capital Park Commission to acquire parkland. The agency's task was to acquire parkland to preserve forests and natural scenery in and around Washington, to prevent pollution of Rock Creek and the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, and to provide for the comprehensive development of the capital's park system. In 1926, the agency was renamed the National Capital Park and Planning Commission and granted comprehensive planning authority to oversee housing reform, respond to traffic issues, and plan for commercial and industrial development. Also during this era of the organization, Congress authorized NCPC to prepare and adopt urban renewal plans. In 1952, the National Capital Planning Act renamed the NCPC as the National Capital Planning Commission and clarified its role as a federal agency. The act established NCPC as the central planning agency for the federal government in the National Capital Region. NCPC and the District of Columbia jointly share responsibility for creation of the comprehensive plan for the national capital. Finally, through the DC Home Rule Act, a 1973 amendment of the 1952 Planning Act changed NCPC's status as a central planning agency for the district. It made NCPC responsible for preparing and adopting only the federal elements of the comprehensive plan. The Home Rule Act effectively transferred the responsibility for purely local planning functions to the new district government. At that point, housing, zoning, parks and recreation, and other planning matters devolved to the district government. Today, planning responsibilities are now shared between the federal and district governments. This is unique in the United States. While the district government is responsible for planning for private and locally owned properties, they do not have the ability to plan for federal properties. NCPC retained its authority to plan for the national capital and review federal development. Our agency plans for the National Capital Region, which includes Washington, D.C., and the adjoining counties in Maryland and Virginia. Through planning, policymaking, and project review, NCPC protects and advances the federal government's interest in the region's development. The Commission provides overall planning guidance for federal land and buildings in the region by reviewing the design of federal and certain local projects, overseeing long-range planning for future development, and monitoring capital investments by federal agencies. Briefly, we wish to give an overview of NCPC's organization as a federal agency. It is composed of 8 federal representatives and 4 local representatives. The 3 federal agency representatives from 3 of the largest land holding agencies within the region, the Department of Defense, the National Park Service, and the General Services Administration, also serve on the Commission. The Commission staff supports the agency by working to review and administer federal project proposals and making recommendations to the Commission. NCPC is comprised of 4 divisions: Policy and Research, Urban Design and Plan Review, Office of Public Engagement, and the Physical Planning Division, as I discussed earlier. Each division performs specialized tasks related to NCPC's overall mission and goals. NCPC's work is centered on 4 core activities: preparation of the comprehensive plan for the national capital's federal elements, review federal projects within the region, the site and the design of memorials and certain projects within the district, the preparation of the federal capital improvement program, and other special initiatives such as commemoration. Our division works on many of the congressionally mandated core programs, including the comprehensive plan and federal capital improvements program, and many special initiatives that address current and emerging issues related to commemoration, security, urban form, and equity. Today, we will focus on the core responsibility of updating and revising the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is a document that guides planning and development within Washington, D.C. and the surrounding region, which we term the environs. It is comprised of 2 parts: the district elements, which are handled by the Office of Planning for Washington, D.C., and the federal elements. And I will today focus on the federal elements. The federal elements serve as the blueprint for the long-term development of the national capital and the decision-making framework for Commission actions on plans, proposals, and policies for federal land and building developments submitted for its review. The federal components are comprised of 8 federal elements: urban design, federal workplace, foreign missions and international organizations, transportation, parks and open space, federal environment, historic preservation, and visitors and commemoration. NCPC has traditionally followed an iterative and staggered process when it comes to updating each federal element over time, typically reviewing and updating an element every 2 to 3 years, incorporating new planning principles and policies in its mission to enhance the historical, cultural, and natural resources and federal assets of the National Capital Region. Revisions to the parks and open space element, for example, were adopted in 2018, and revisions to the transportation element were adopted in 2020. The federal workplace element while originally scheduled for a final update in 2021, has been postponed as we continue to evaluate the effects on workplace trends post-pandemic. This year, our focus will be to revise the introduction chapter to the federal elements to create guiding principles and a framework that can be used to address a broad and updated set of critical planning challenges and future updates to all of these federal elements. The introduction chapter outlines the planning framework for the comprehensive plan's federal elements. The comprehensive plan's federal elements are linked by currently three guiding principles. One, to accommodate federal and national capital activities. Two, to reinforce smart growth and sustainable development planning principles. And the third, to support local and regional planning and development. While the comprehensive plan accommodates federal and national activities in the region, plans for sustainable growth and development, and supports local and regional planning and development objectives. However, it lacks targeted policies, actions, and investments to improve outcomes for people of color, members of the LGBTQ+ communities, people with disabilities, and those adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. It also lacks analysis of direct and indirect impacts to these groups. While NCPC's mission and authorities have limited application to development on non-federal lands, there is still a need for a thorough evaluation of the comprehensive plan to determine which policies may lead to unintended barriers for underserved communities and where new or revised policies could reduce those barriers, particularly on racial and income inequities in the region and opportunities for improving accessibility for people with disabilities. NCPC also needs a comprehensive framework to examine potential inequities in the comprehensive plan and support equity outcomes across policy topics. I wish to note that the proposed changes to the introduction chapter were catalyzed by guidance from this administration that seek to address equity, which includes Executive Order 13985, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, which was signed in February of 2021, and Executive Order 14091, further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, which was signed in February of 2023, both of which directs the federal government and its agencies to pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity for all, including people of color and others who have been historically underserved, marginalized, and adversely affected by persistent poverty and inequality. In response to these executive orders, NCPC prepared an equity action plan in 2021, which was amended in 2023, and identified 5 action items that will help the agency address and incorporate equity considerations. As identified in action item number 2 of the equity action plan, NCPC will develop a comprehensive framework and guiding principles within the introduction chapter to address equity across the plan, guide subsequent updates, and inform agency review and planning initiatives. Additionally, NCPC's efforts also respond to Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which was signed in February of 2021, and Executive Order 14096, revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all, which was signed in April of 2023, that attempt to address adverse environmental and health impacts as a result of climate change. In response to these executive orders, NCPC prepared a climate action plan in 2021 and identified 5 priority adaptation actions. As identified in one of the priority adaptation actions, NCPC will update the federal elements to incorporate climate action adaptation strategies into guidance for decision-making and planning and increase awareness of current climate change risks. The draft introduction chapter update is intended to modernize the chapter to address critical planning challenges identified within the National Capital Region. This includes incorporating equity and climate resiliency considerations in the comprehensive plan, as identified again by NCPC's equity and climate action plans, as well as planning for the changing workplace environment within the region as the federal government shrinks its office footprint. The draft update provides the historical context of underserved communities in the region, unjust planning actions that may have affected these communities, as well as a new principle guiding the agency's equitable planning policies. The draft document proposes to incorporate new policy guidance addressing the changing economic and environmental landscape because of the COVID-19 pandemic and a rapidly changing climate. Specifically, through these revisions, staff is seeking to, one, engage with stakeholders and underserved communities to identify and develop an equity framework. Two, update statistics and data points to reflect current trends and critical planning challenges. Three, incorporate a historical context and reflection of NCPC's practices and the impacts on underserved communities. Fourth, expand upon existing smart growth principles to address sustainability, climate change, and resiliency. And last, but certainly not least, to establish a comprehensive framework to address equity. Currently, we're in the third phase of this project, which is engaging with community organizations and local federal agencies. Following these stakeholder engagements, staff finalized the draft principles and key considerations in the introduction chapter and prepared a first draft for review by the commission. The commission released that first draft in December. We are now again engaging with stakeholders to receive additional feedback as we build to final adoption, hopefully within the spring. From here, I will turn this back over to Brittany to discuss the major changes to the introduction chapter.
Thank you, Krishan. As Krishan mentioned, there were 5 major goals that we had for updating the introduction chapter, and that included engaging with stakeholders from underserved communities, updating our statistics and data to reflect current planning trends, incorporating historical context and reflection of NCPC practices and the impacts on underserved community, expanding upon existing smart growth principles to address sustainability and climate change, and then also establishing a comprehensive framework to address equity. Our first major revision isn't necessarily a revision, but centers on the process that our staff use to engage stakeholders and organizations representing people from underserved communities to identify and develop that equity framework that I just mentioned. We took a series of steps, including conducting an equity analysis on different policies and programs that impacted underserved communities throughout the National Capital Region. We also took time to identify what those contemporary impacts of those policies were, and then also clarifying NCPC's role and scope to address those impacts in the present day. From there, we analyzed those contemporary impacts and policies and what NCPC's role was. And we then met with community organizations to then review our draft equity principle and key objectives that correspond with them. This framework and proposed equity principle was presented to individuals representing approximately 30 different community stakeholders. And those organizations provided a variety of feedback to our team. We met with local community organizations in January of 2023. We met with local planning agencies and local university representatives in May of 2023. We also took time and met with the Committee of 100 in July, and in November of 2023, we met with federal agencies and representatives from federal agencies. And during these meetings, staff discussed the history of NCPC, the purpose of the comprehensive plan, and identified those different NCPC administered policies in the past that may have had adverse impacts on local communities. We reviewed the process that we developed for revising the introduction chapter with an equity-based focus, and reviewed the draft equity principle and corresponding key objectives. Across all of our focus group discussions, community engagement with underrepresented groups was regarded as the primary consideration that NCPC should focus its efforts on more clearly, and to develop policies and regulations in the comprehensive plan that address equity around community engagement. Focus group participants recommended that NCPC focus on crafting additional tools to outreach with local community organizations and to help them better understand NCPC's authority and the differences between the federal interests and what NCPC does and the district and other local governments' involvement in the development review process. Feedback from these discussion groups were then incorporated in the introduction chapter revision, which I will walk through now. The second major revision of the introduction chapter involves updating statistical information to reflect current trends and address pressing land use and development challenges. The current introduction chapter was last updated in 2016, and thus it does not include some of the more recent scientific data and existing conditions covering land use, environmental, and workplace challenges, such as climate change and resiliency, and the changing nature and location of work. Staff have incorporated updated data on visitor information, workforce trends, and economic statistics throughout the document. Additionally, the 2016 chapter does not include information pertaining to the devastating impacts on the local economy, population health, and social cohesion as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. To respond to this, staff created a new section in our introduction chapter titled Critical Planning Challenges. This section describes the existing conditions for 5 issues that federal planners and policymakers must address with urgency in the 21st century and highlights the agency's previous and ongoing actions implemented through our work programs that address these topics. The 5 critical planning challenges are environmental sustainability and resiliency, social health and racial equity, commemoration diversity, urban space and security, and the changing federal footprint. The third major revision involves providing a broader context of urban planning history in the National Capital Region that acknowledges the presence of Indigenous and underserved communities and the direct and contemporary impacts of planning policies, practices, and programs on these groups. Our agency, NCPC, has played a key role in shaping the National Capital Region into the vibrant and culturally diverse economic region that we know and love today. Many of the projects that NCPC has been responsible for initiating or implementing over our 100-year history have had very positive impacts on our region and have also worked to enhance equity throughout the region as well. Some of these successes include NCPC's involvement in the preparation of the Mass Transportation Study of 1955, which was a congressionally directed report that recommended, among other things, the creation of a 33-mile rapid transit system that we know as WMATA today. The development, another project that our agency was responsible for supporting included the development of the influential Year 2000 plan, which proposed a model for long-term regional growth. The Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission then incorporated the plan guidance into their documents, Wedges and Corridor, and expanded on this recommended model in its comprehensive plan. This framework continues to guide and shape the growth and development in Montgomery and Prince George's County today. Another project that our agency has worked on to help create equity and also diversify the commemoration landscape includes the Museums and Memorials Master Plan. And this document was designed to advance the vision for Washington's monumental core expressed in the Legacy Plan. NCPC, the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, the National Capital Memorial Advisory Commission identified 100 potential sites for future memorials and museums and provided general guidelines, citing criteria and implementation strategies to help make this happen. And so while we acknowledge that our agency has done some very outstanding work and some very beneficial work to the region, some of our earlier work has led to inequities and presented barriers to equity. And this is what we're here to talk about and address today. So the existing federal elements of the comprehensive plan as adopted in 2016 largely excludes the influence of Indigenous planning and colonial development practices that predate the 1791 L'Enfant Plan. The reality is that today's Washington, D.C. is the result of a confluence of cultures dating back nearly 4,000 years prior to the development of Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital. To reflect this history, 2 new paragraphs were added to the beginning of the L'Enfant Plan era section. These paragraphs provide additional context to the development of Washington, D.C. prior to 1791 and identify the presence of Indigenous people in the National Capital Region prior to European settlement. We also acknowledge the importance of Irish and Scottish immigrants in shaping Georgetown as a merchant port, and highlight the work of Benjamin Banneker, a free Black man, in finalizing L'Enfant's plan with brothers Andrew and Benjamin Ellicott. Additionally, a new section was created called Confronting the Legacy, examining the impacts of NCPC's past. This section delves into the present-day equity implications of planning projects or policies that were prepared, reviewed, or adopted by NCPC. It is important to note that prior to the congressional enactment of the District of Columbia's Home Rule Act in December of 1973, NCPC and its predecessor, the National Capital Park and Planning Commission, served as the planning agency for the District of Columbia. The agency was responsible for local planning initiatives, including housing, transportation, park and recreation planning, school planning, many of which are currently under the purview of the District Office of Planning today. The three legacy policies that staff analyzed were planning for a segregated parks and recreation system, where through the 1940s, NCPPC planned for a segregated parks and recreation system throughout the district. And this practice disproportionately allocated recreational spaces for residents based on race and prohibited non-white residents from accessing certain prominent public spaces. The second policy that we looked at was urban renewal and the practice of using urban renewal programs to displace residents and businesses. Beginning in 1945, NCPPC began the process to plan, prepare, and adopt 12 urban renewal plans to restore blighted areas that posed a danger to the health, safety, and welfare of residents. These programs displaced thousands of residents and businesses, primarily African-American residents were impacted by this process, particularly when thinking about the pilot project of urban renewal, which was implemented in Southwest Washington, D.C. The third policy that we looked at, or the third practice, looks at integrating federal campuses in local communities. And this major policy really focuses on the expansion of federal campuses and buildings into long-established communities that have often, or in some instances, restricted residents' ability to access physical spaces or to open space and other neighborhood amenities. This section concludes with a recommitment of NCPC's work to consider and advance equity through our planning and policies. Our fourth major revision focuses on expanding smart growth principles to address sustainability, climate change, and resiliency. The federal government owns approximately 85% of the shorelines in Washington, D.C., and has many properties located within the 100-year and 500-year floodplains. Federal properties are thus vulnerable to flooding that results from heavy rain, snowmelt, tropical storms, hurricanes, and flash flood events. The adopted 2016 version of the Guiding Principle 2 states to reinforce smart growth and sustainable development planning principle. This principle seeks to encourage the development with smart growth practices, advocating for compact, mixed-use, and pedestrian-oriented development near high-capacity transit routes. The updated principle is revised to read, reinforce resilient and sustainable development planning principles. This revision aligns with the urgency to plan federal buildings, lands, and campuses, considering the unpredictability of climate change, and encompasses traditional smart growth planning while emphasizing planning for ecological compatibility and resilience in the face of climate change. The final major revision establishes a comprehensive framework for equity. This is informed by our equity stakeholder meetings, discussions with our internal equity task force, the executive orders, as Krishan mentioned earlier, and our new equity-focused guiding principle. Similar to the structure for existing guiding principles, the new equity principle incorporates key objectives to inform future amendments to the federal elements within consideration to equity. The new equity-focused principle referenced in introduction chapter now as guiding principle number 4, and the corresponding key objectives reads as follows. The equity principle is to incorporate planning objectives that promote equitable development and opportunity for underserved communities. The corresponding key objectives highlight important components of equity and are organized in a thematic framework. So they are community engagement, cultural affirmation and diversity, data analysis, economic development, physical access, and sustainability and resilience. Sustainability, resilience, and health. The new guiding principle and key objectives will be used to provide the framework for changes to the submission guidelines. And so I'll read in detail each of the key objectives as well. So community engagement includes to engage with underserved communities in a responsive, transparent, inclusive manner, which allows communities to understand policy proposals and participate in bi-directional conversations with public officials. Cultural affirmation and diversity is to affirm the importance of local cultural identity and traditions and recognize the role that cultural recognition plays in supporting civic engagement and community enrichment. Data analysis, which is to use qualitative and quantitative data to identify and track the legacy and contemporary impacts of policies, practices, and procedures relating to federal development that have adversely impacted underserved communities. Economic development, which is to advance economic opportunity through economic development and investment in sites and workforces in communities with underserved populations. Physical access, which is to promote universal and equitable access for visitors to on-site public amenities and for employees to amenities in the surrounding community. And finally, sustainability, resilience, and health, which is to improve human health and protect federal assets in underserved communities through investment in resilient planning practices that mitigate the impacts of climate change. So with that, that concludes our major revisions to the introduction chapter, and I will turn it over to Melissa Linshaw, who will open up our question and answer portion of this session.
Thank you, Brittany. We've had a couple questions. I'm just going to go really quickly through them, but please add more questions to the Q&A section. Right now, people were wondering if the same material is going to be covered on the in-person meeting on February 20th, which it will be the same material being presented. There's also going to be a recording of this presentation that will be available on the website, and I included the website link again in the answer portion of the Q&A. And then there was a question about when the DC elements will be updated and discussed, and I responded that the DC elements were recently updated and adopted in 2021, and so I provided the link to that, but they are in the process of starting the rewrite process soon. So in the near future, look out for that for the DC comprehensive plan. And that is all right now, but please submit any questions and we will answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I will now turn it over to Laura Shipman to provide an update on the submission guidelines.
Thank you, Brittany. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Laura Shipman. I'm a planner with the Urban Design and Plan Review Division of NCPC. Building on the previous presentation, I will now present the corresponding proposed equity updates to the submission guidelines. First, what are submission guidelines? This document outlines how agencies should submit master plans and projects to NCPC for review. The guidelines describe the content of submissions, submission stages, along with the coordination and review process. The previous presentation outlined proposed equity updates to the Comprehensive Plan Introduction chapter. And based on this guidance, staff is proposing updates to the submission guidelines with the aim to encourage federal agency applicants to conduct early and meaningful community engagement and to submit information about the equity impacts of plans and projects to inform the Commission's decision-making process. So that we are all on the same page on what we mean by equity, for this update, we are using definitions for equity and underserved communities outlined in recent executive orders. It is important to note that the term underserved communities refers to both populations and geographic communities. In addition to the topics currently covered in the guidelines, including design, transportation, environmental planning, and historic preservation, the proposed update will now also request that applicants include equity considerations in their project submissions. These considerations are organized by the 6 equity key objectives outlined in the draft introduction chapter. And applicants will also be asked to indicate how the planned project aligns with their agency's equity goals. Equity considerations will be discussed as early as possible in project development and will be integrated into all stages of the project review process. With that context, I will go through and summarize the proposed equity considerations, starting with data analysis. We ask applicants if the project is in or directly adjacent to an underserved community, and if so, to include socioeconomic and environmental indicators. Also to describe if there are any known previous federal development impacts and how they have been addressed. Next is community engagement. The guidelines ask applicants to describe how they have proactively engaged with communities who have historically been excluded from planning processes, how the project has changed to address issues raised, and ongoing plans for engagement. In terms of physical access, we ask if the plan allows equitable access for visitors to on-site public amenities and employees to amenities in the surrounding community, and also any barriers the proposal would create to existing community amenities and connections. Next, the economic development consideration includes the economic benefits or negative impacts that the plan or project could potentially create for underserved communities. Benefits may include increasing investment, enhancing community-serving establishments, connecting residents with construction jobs, or providing long-term employment opportunities. Under cultural affirmation and diversity, we ask about any efforts to partner with communities to incorporate local and underrepresented cultural identities through methods such as programming, commemoration, arts, and education. We also ask applicants to indicate any potential effects on the cultural resources of underserved communities. Finally, the sustainability, resilience, and health consideration asks applicants to describe how the proposal addresses climate change, natural resource, and health impacts to underserved communities. So which plans and projects will these equity submission requirements apply to? We considered applying to all submissions. However, this would create unnecessary burdens on applicants with small projects that have low potential impacts on underserved communities. Instead, we propose applying the submission requirements based on project type. They always apply to master plans and commemorative works, regardless of location. Applicability is a bit more nuanced with building, site, and park projects, where the requirements would only apply to proposals that include site selection or complex projects in or directly adjacent to underserved communities. For the projects where the submission requirements do not apply, we may coordinate with the applicant to gather further information if there are equity concerns. And I should note that based on comments from our commission, we are also exploring applying the guidelines to certain antenna projects. Now I'd like to walk through 2 recent examples of federal projects that illustrate how some of these proposed equity considerations are being raised during the project development and review process. The Pentagon Draft Master Plan submission, reviewed at the October 2023 Commission meeting, included the history of displacement through eminent domain of 2 Black communities, East Arlington and Queen City, for the construction of the Pentagon campus. While the plan acknowledgement of this history was supported by the Commission, they also recommended there be efforts to go beyond historic documentation and include interpretive signage or other types of permanent memorialization and consultation with descendants of the displaced communities. The Commission also recommended that due to past housing displacement, that applicants should include affordable housing in their future development feasibility study for potential uses on underutilized parking lots. This plan review illustrates how an applicant could begin to address impacts previously created by federal development in their current submission. Previous impacts should be acknowledged and addressed with mitigation measures where possible, especially if within the scope of the current plan or project. Another example is the Bureau of Engraving and Printing Currency Production Facility, a project that received final approval by the Commission in October. The project includes significant economic development and sustainability components. However, health equity concerns were highlighted by staff during review. The applicant identified a directly adjacent environmental justice community of concern, and staff requested that due to identified traffic impacts, the applicant provide an analysis of impacts on air quality in that community and potential mitigation measures. Overall, staff review of applicant responses to the proposed equity considerations is intended to highlight areas early for future revision and refinement, and to frame the issues for the Commission for the decision-making process. And that concludes the guidelines update overview. We will now respond to any additional questions and comments that have been submitted during the meeting. Feel free to continue to enter your written questions and comments through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen.
Great, thank you. So we do have a couple more questions, and some of these I would definitely like the presenters to answer themselves. And so the first one is, the data analysis seemed to refer to tracking conditions that affect underserved communities, but what about monitoring and evaluating the effects of the implementation of the plan? So I will turn that over to Brittany to answer.
Thank you, Melissa. And I think that's a really good question. And so when the intention of the data analysis question, or the data analysis key objective, was to really think about how NCPC's authority and role in the National Capital Region has evolved since the DC Home Rule Act. And so we recognize that because of the changing nature of our authority, that there may have been policies or practices or projects that we implemented prior to 1973 that we may not have as much authority or ability to directly impact today. So what we were looking to do, or the intention of that objective, is to track current and ongoing effects on underserved communities. And because the introduction chapter helps to shape and guide future element updates will also then use the same framework to use data to evaluate the ongoing effects of planned policies and projects on local communities. So the introduction chapter is really helping to establish the framework for future element updates, which will of course take a little deeper dive into how to track and monitor the impacts of the plan in the future. Additionally, the introduction chapter provides guidance to the submission guidelines, which Laura walked through today. And through the submission guidelines, that will also capture some additional data and insights around the impacts of development, particularly at the federal installation level for neighboring or surrounding communities. So,
Yep, thank you. And yes, just to really emphasize, NCPC does not implement plans, but reviews plans and other federal agencies' plans. And so always keep that in mind when we are presenting. And then also, let me go to the next question. Does NCPC see a role in addressing and remediating past actions that have resulted in significant inequities? The principals seem to principally acknowledge past inequitable actions and seek to avoid future ones, but don't see anything that would proactively take intentional actions to correct past inequitable outcomes. And so the team would like to answer that one as well.
I could say, just going back to the example of the Pentagon master plan review, that was an example where the history was acknowledged in the draft master plan, but the commission also recommended measures to address the past harms of displacement. And so that's one example in our review process of how we can recommend measures to address those past harms.
Yeah, and I'll also add that we are working with applicants to identify and acknowledge past issues and look for opportunities within those project scopes to address those past practices, as Laura mentioned. And the focus is really on identifying and addressing equity issues related to the current project. So we do have some limitations in scope there. And And yeah.
Great. Thank you. And if you have follow-up questions based on our answers, please feel free to add those also in the Q&A function. And then the next one is, for clarification, can you describe the approval process for both long-range plans and the application plans for projects? Thank you. So maybe kind of just a little 101 on our approval process for both sites.
So I could describe it for federal agency applicants for their master plans, which are usually long-range plans. We ask applicants to submit master plans and master plan updates around every 5 years. Typically, those plans will be sent to NCPC for review and go to our commission at concept, at draft, and then again at final master plan. And then for our projects, depending on the complexity of the project, we may review that at concept, then again at preliminary plan, and then finally for final review. So all of the plans will come to our agency, be reviewed by staff, and then be presented to our commission. For some projects that are in the environs, as Krishan mentioned, those locations outside of the District of Columbia, those projects are often referred to local planning agencies and local agencies and state agencies for review prior to our review. So there's a referral process for those projects.
Thank you. And then lastly, so far we have one last one for Laura. How will NCPC enforce the new submission policies to track and monitor the effectiveness of the policies?
So as with any other policies in the comprehensive plan or in our submission guidelines, this is guidance. It will be weighed against other policies, but it's important to inform our commission for their decision-making process. The enforcement will be through an iterative process of requests for information or requests or recommendations for changes to the plan. Sometimes what happens is if applicants are not able to meet our recommendations, we recommend that the project be presented to the commission as opposed to a delegated action or something that is reviewed by just our executive director or projects that are just reviewed on consent. We want it to be an open session so that we can go through all of the issues and have the commission then weigh in. So really, we're presenting the issues for the commission to allow them to make the decision on whether the project will be approved.
Okay, so right now I don't have any other questions, but please, we'll be, I think, on for a little bit longer if people come up with anything else they'd like us to answer. But I think right now we are good. So here we go. Where in the intro chapter are the submission guideline considerations discussed? Is it worth adding to the intro chapter text?
So the submission guidelines are actually separate from the intro chapter. The submission guidelines they're actually available. There's a draft on the website for this initiative, and also later, once adopted, they will be under our review section of our website and available to applicants and to the public to see. So they have a separate function from the introduction chapter of the comprehensive plan.
They went ahead and added the link to the specific guidelines that's on our website.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and with that, I will just share. We're waiting for if there are any additional questions. I will share all of our contact information about how you can submit public comments, and then also our next meeting, which will be on February 20th. So if you don't have any additional questions, you can feel free to leave as that concludes our portion of the presentation. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A function. But if you do not have any, we are concluded with our presentation for today. Our next meeting will be on February 20th at the NCPC offices in person. This presentation on February 20th covers the same content that we went over today. So please feel free to share the meeting information with any colleagues, neighbors, friends, other stakeholders that may be interested. It does cover the same information that we reviewed today. If you have any questions, feel free to email our team at info@ncpc.gov, or you can visit our project website at ncpc.gov/initiatives/intro. And thank you again for attending our session today.